Folks, we'll get going here momentarily. I'm just waiting for a green light from the back room. There we go. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Thursday, November 14, 2019 meeting of the Edina Housing and Redevelopment Authority. Would you call roll, please, Ms. Karski?
Commissioner Fisher?
Here.
Commissioner Staunton?
Here.
Commissioner Brindle?
Here.
Commissioner Anderson?
Here.
Chair Hovland?
Here. For those of you, if you wish to join the members of the HRA in the Pledge of Allegiance, please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And we have a form of agenda in front of us this morning. Is there anyone that wishes to modify the agenda? Including our executive director? Okay, no? Nope. Not hearing anything. Is there a motion to approve the agenda as shown?
So moved. Second.
Got a motion and a second to approve the agenda as shown. Discussion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. Next is community comment. Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to address the HRA on a matter of concern to them? Okay. Hearing nothing, seeing no one coming forward, we'll move on to the consent agenda. Is there anyone who wishes to remove an item from the consent agenda? Is there a motion to adopt the consent agenda as shown?
Second.
Got a motion and second to adopt the consent agenda as shown. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. And then we are on to a few items in the reports and recommendations portion of the agenda. And the first matter there is the potential acquisition of property at 4040 West 70th Street. And that is a discussion only, no action needed, but just an update from our Affordable Housing Development Manager, Stephanie Hawkinson. Welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning,
and you were working last night, too.
I was. Everything for the city. This item, as you stated, is regarding the acquisition of 4040 West 70th. It's a follow-up to our discussion on October 24th, at which time many questions were raised. As with that time, I do not have a specific, fully vetted development proposal to discuss with you, but rather answers to some of the questions that were raised. I'm going to digress for just a second, because one of the big questions was whether government should interfere with the private market. Throughout history, we have. Last night, I was reminded that your predecessors, albeit a long time ago, interfered with the private market by not allowing African Americans and people of Jewish faith to live here. We also zone, which makes it so a developer cannot build a high-rise in a residential neighborhood. We have building codes. You get my point. The government is involved already. We can't change history, but we can the future. We can be proactive in shaping the type of development we want to see. Specifically, at the last meeting, Commissioners Fisher and Staunton had asked if acquisition of property or providing interim financing for acquisition was something the HRA wanted to explore. In the same vein, it was raised whether there are other cities that proactively secure land in order to fulfill the redevelopment goals. Clearly, I cannot answer for the HRA on what you want to do, but I can let you know that other communities proactively compete with the private market to acquire sites as they become available on the open market in order to work towards their goals for the city. In which case, most of it is to facilitate the creation of affordable housing. In the staff report, I list 5 cities that acquire land to fulfill their goals. These 5 are a sampling of a whole. There are others, with the largest close example being Minneapolis. Unfortunately, the private market does not necessarily comply with the public process. We have the benefit of having the Housing Foundation, who is nimble and can act within the private market's timeline. The Housing Foundation is seeking to purchase 4040 West 70th Street for the purpose of developing affordable senior housing. They believe the site is ideal for this use due to its location with access to transit, shopping, entertainment, and health resources. Affordable housing is in demand in Edina. At Avidor, the 18 affordable units were the first to fill, and there's now a year-long waiting list. Through a preliminary market analysis completed by a developer of affordable senior housing, there is currently a vacancy rate of just over 1%. The lack of affordable options for seniors makes it challenging to fulfill the goal of aging in place. This is an opportunity to create up to 117 units of affordable senior housing rather than just the 20% as would be required through our affordable housing policy. The Housing Foundation is negotiating a purchase agreement with the seller. The LOI was accepted. Once the property is acquired, the foundation will define the development parameters in keeping with the Greater Southdale Small Area Plan, oversee the request for proposal process to secure a developer, and hold the site through the developer's regulatory and approval process. The HRA will receive updates throughout the process, and the City Council will have the final approval of the plans. Although the questions were raised regarding the development pro forma, and there was acknowledgement that it's too early in the process, the foundation proceeded with entering into a letter of intent by analyzing the cost of land in Edina and comparing this site to other affordable housing developments. As demonstrated in the staff report, on a per-unit basis, the acquisition costs for the other affordable housing developments in Edina range from $20,968 per unit to $55,128 per unit or per door. The acquisition of 4040 West 70th falls somewhere in the middle at roughly $32,479 per door. The foundation has run numbers to determine the feasibility of this development and determined that there's a path forward with utilizing the traditional sources that are typically required to finance a development that is 100% affordable. In order to maximize the utility of the site, the current building would most likely be demolished to make way for a building designed to be residential. As stated previously, one question was raised at the previous HRA meeting was the using of TIF 2 funds for the acquisition of property and what all the parameters are around that. Nick is here to help me answer some of those questions and to let you know what the process is and how the length that is involved with securing those funds if we want to do this for acquisition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. The city has identified an opportunity to acquire some property and has a resource in the form of pooled money from Southdale 2 TIF district to do so. In order to access those funds, there are some processes involved, as TIF is highly regulated within the statutes as well as special legislation that the city has adopted for its use. Namely, if TIF is to be used to acquire property within the city, that property needs to be designated within a tax increment financing plan. Typically, we would do this at the onset when a district is established. We'd identify the parcels within that TIF district and say that those parcels may or may not be, depending on the purview of the HRA, acquired using those future TIF dollars. In the case of pooled money from Southdale 2, the district is already created, and you have an opportunity now to spend that money outside of the boundaries of that particular TIF district. But within that plan, we have not designated these specific properties that you could potentially acquire. Part of the process requires a public hearing in order to identify those properties. We have not yet done that, but with your guidance, we could establish a public hearing in the future to modify that existing Southdale 2 TIF plan and identify one, two, or many properties within the city with which you intend to use those funds to acquire property. But that is the process that would need to be put in place prior to the ability to commit those funds or enter into a purchase agreement where those funds would be expended.
Questions for Mr. Anhut? Commissioners?
I do, thank you.
Mr. Anderson.
In fact, I have a few because I knew that you'd be here this morning, and I knew that you would be able to give clarity on a lot of questions that float around. And one of them you've just answered, so thank you for that. On that topic, so the Southdale 2 TIF district exists, and so by using the housing pool that exists there, it's not necessary to create a new TIF district, for instance, at 4040 West 70th. Is that accurate? To comply with the statutory requirements.
So the district has its own pooling authority that you can use for housing purposes that does not rely on the special legislation. You would have to follow that procedure that I just laid out, that you'd have to identify the property within the TIF plan subject to a public hearing. You also have an opportunity to expand your pooling base, the amount of money that you can spend from Southdale 2 if you utilize the parameters of the special legislation that was given to the city in 2014. That particular use of funds does require you to establish a new special TIF district that's designated within that special legislation. So yes and no.
Okay, so it's really, then if the decision was made to acquire the property, it's really a matter of the funds that are used to acquire it as to whether or not a new TIF district would be required there.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Then, and possibly our finance director is the better person to ask this question of, because I know it's been touched on before, but I just want to, because this is a discussion this morning, I want to try to bring all these points out. It's a large TIF district, and so the balance remaining today is roughly 13 million or in that area. Is that accurate?
Approximately.
Okay.
Correct.
And so of that 13 million, we have access for affordable housing to 40% of that. Is that accurate or inaccurate?
No, that's inaccurate. Nick,
Okay.
do you want to talk about the spreadsheet that you prepared, laying out the...
Sure. So the ability to pool money is based on a percentage. You do have a percentage of the revenue that's been collected over time that you can spend on activities outside of the TIF district for affordable housing purposes. We have identified through an analysis, if we take to the term of Southdale 2's collections to 2021, potentially there is $15 million that the HRA could spend on affordable housing.
Through 2021?
Through 2021, so
Okay.
with 2 more years of collection.
Okay.
You also have some obligations within Southdale 2 to repay the original interfund loan that was given to spur development in the Southdale property, so that a part of the funds that are available right now is encumbered, if you will, for that very purpose. The balance of that loan is less than $3 million
Correct.
that's remaining.
Yep.
Potentially, you could expend the other $10 million on affordable housing purposes. However, we need to make sure that we're within the overall parameters for the full life of the district. So I think that money is available to spend today. We do expect that you'll have a larger amount available through 2021. It's just not there yet.
Okay, so there's no working percentage of the accrued increments that remain in that TIF district that is designated only for affordable housing. So is that accurate?
We have a limitation
A limitation, thank you.
on what we can expend,
Uh-huh.
but there's not a limitation on maybe the revenue side, if I understand your question correctly.
Yeah, what I'm trying to get to is I've consistently been under the impression, and possibly erroneous impression, that only a certain percentage of those accrued increments can be used for other purposes, and then X amount remains. And I've been kind of working on the assumption that 40% is used towards affordable housing, and that represents the 7.2 million or so that I often see cited, and then the remainder would essentially be available for distribution at the end or at the decertification date. Doesn't sound like that's right on the money.
The HRA has the authority under the special legislation as well as its normal pooling allowance to potentially expend up to 55%.
55%. Okay. Thank you very much. That's the question. Okay. We talked about conditions attached to pooling. Can housing pool funds be used to acquire existing units to be designated as affordable housing?
The use of the pooling is based on the ability to create or preserve affordable housing. And there are some parameters to that. There needs to be a certain level of affordability. There also needs to be a certain amount of units within that development that are set aside for affordable purposes, as well as a time, at least 15 years, possibly 25 if we're using the special legislation. If you meet those parameters, yes, you can acquire existing property to preserve that affordability. You can acquire market rate property and then convert it to affordable use.
Yes.
Or develop new affordable housing.
Thank you. Let's see. 2 things. So if the decision's made to acquire the property, and we don't have a proposal, we're simply making a decision as to whether or not we should buy it. We're not even doing that today. We're simply discussing it. But if we decide to move ahead and no acceptable proposal comes forward, if market conditions change, if there's rethinking, if the area market study doesn't indicate that we can go to this density, is there an escape route? I mean, do we simply own this parcel and it's to be used for that purpose only, and we're locked into that, and over some period of time, again, if no acceptable proposal were to come forward?
If we use TIF funds to acquire that site, one, we would have had to have gone through the process that I laid out earlier. We would be restricting the potential development on that site. However, it is an asset still. So we still have land which has value. That land could be sold and funds returned to the TIF district to make it whole. We could potentially enter into various agreements with a party who's willing to develop that property, provide some recourse in the event that they are not able to develop that property within a certain time frame, return those funds again to the TIF district to make it whole, and you would be at a net zero, if you will, or whatever overhead costs were incurred in that process.
So the methodology there would be, if in that event, if that were to occur, then the city simply sells the parcel at market and returns it to the TIF district. It can be restored in that way. Now,
it would have to be.
It has to be, yes, thank you.
Correct.
That's the second part of the question, is it can't be used in any other way, even for affordable housing purposes.
If you can find a way to use it for affordable, then you will have met the requirement to
Okay.
expend the funds. But
Okay.
if for whatever reason, things fall apart, worst case scenario, we need to sell it to another market participant who's not going to build affordable housing, we can still return the funds to the TIF district and then redistribute them later.
Okay, I understand, thank you. Last thing, okay, so the staff report references use of tax-exempt bonds because of the size of the project. And we would be using their 4% low-income housing tax credits as opposed to the 9% that were used on Amundsen and on West 76th. So does that accrue as debt? Maybe that's a question for the finance director as well. Those tax-exempt bonds do not?
Chair, Commissioner, the owner, the developer would borrow the funds, the bonds. And that is the way that they are able to get the 4% tax credits, and then it's debt on them.
On them?
Yep,
Okay.
the
So
city
we are
is not a
then the-
participant.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. We are not the issuing authority.
We are not the issue.
Okay, thank you.
We're
Okay.
not, the city would not be the obligated party in that the city would still have to participate in the process. Nonprofit or certain even for-profit entities who are accessing tax-exempt financing cannot do so on their own. The way the tax code is set up, they need to go through a municipality.
Yep,
So the
that's correct.
IRS has
Yep.
basically said that the cities or counties or state will act as the issuer of the bonds, but we would have an obligation established on that private party. They would have every responsibility to make all of the payments. There would be no general obligation pledge of the city toward any of that, but you would be involved in
So
the
we're
process
just as conduit.
as a conduit issuer. That's exactly the term. And even as part of the approval process with awarding those tax credits, the city would have to evaluate the project and actually provide Minnesota Housing an analysis that says that those tax credits and that tax exemption is needed to fund the project. So there is some additional vetting that the city would undertake as part of that project, above and beyond a normal TIF project.
Okay. Thank you. You've been very helpful. Thank you very much.
So I think the tag-along question there from the Commissioner Anderson is, will that, though we're acting as a conduit, will that debt obligation show up on our balance sheet?
It will not show up on your balance sheet. The auditors typically do like to list conduit issuances in the back in the notes of the audit, and they are certainly something that the city will be tracking. Those who have sought conduit issuance. We do track and make sure that they're upholding their end of the bargain, but it will not show up on your balance sheet. It will not be a debt of the city.
Mr. Mayor, or Mr. Chair. And we do have a statutory annual maximum limit of conduit debt we can issue. Is that true, Mr. Anhut, or not?
It's not true. However, the conduit issuance, if it's tax exempt debt, it will
Yeah.
count against
Our bank qualifier?
your bank qualification. I don't know that that's really an issue, depending on the level and scope of infrastructure projects that the city's going to undertake. It typically is not an issue, but it's something that we can keep an eye on, certainly.
Other questions?
Just following up on that, you'll see this sometimes, this conduit financing, hospitals, healthcare. I don't know if we've done it as a city
have.
before. Right, so, and it's basically us just utilizing the apparatus, if you will, to facilitate a nonprofit going forward with some financing.
We typically do a small debt. We'll issue a small fee on top of the debt to take some money out of it, too.
For some of the administrative costs of managing it. Okay, thank you. Can I just, one more question? So,
Commissioner.
following up on Commissioner Anderson's questions on pages 3 and 4 of Ms. Hawkinson's memo, there's a discussion of the Southdale 2 TIF housing pool and talking about the anticipated balance of $7.2 million, and then the Southdale 2 special legislation pool with an anticipated balance of $4.3 million. Are those two funds, you and Commissioner Anderson had a back and forth. Can you identify which is which for me on that, in the context of that conversation?
I don't have her memo in front of me right now, but I
Or
can just
maybe-
elaborate. We have, through the analysis, identified that there was roughly $7.5 million that would be available under the normal pooling provisions.
So even
You have
before the
spent some
special
of that money.
legislation happened,
Correct.
We
There
would
have
have-
been already,
we could have utilized it for this purpose without
Correct.
creating a new district, et cetera.
correct.
And it's
Correct.
the special legislation that has the $4.3 million.
We also have an additional amount now you've potentially committed to providing some of that to other projects, namely the Aon project, as well as potentially the Amundsen project. So there are many projects that are in the queue,
Right.
perhaps, and that's why that number is down to $4 million, rather than the remainder to get up to the $8 million in total.
So I guess maybe my question is it 7.2 million plus 4.3 million, or is the 4.3 million part of the 7.2 million?
That's correct. There should be 11
So it's
million
total
left
11.
outside of the queue.
Okay, thank you.
Again,
Commissioner Fisher.
this is capacity to spend money, not certainly under the purview of the HRA. The HRA would have to take action to actually spend that money that's not committed today.
I think what's really great about this conversation is that because normal TIF legislation isn't that complicated, it's good to have special legislation to add on to. It's like there's. So my question is about, earlier you were talking about the public hearing. So if we want to add a site or multiple sites you talked about, you'd have a public hearing and add those sites. I'm assuming, just as we didn't know a month ago what site there might be, we're not going to know a month from now what new sites there might be. So the idea of a public hearing, you could technically have multiple public hearings and amend sites into obviously the near future, because we have 2 years to make all this happen, correct?
Correct. And I think part of the discussion, perhaps segueing into Amundsen, is, we have a public hearing that's already established for consideration of an affordable housing project. There may be an opportunity to try to utilize that public hearing to identify or take care of other public hearing requirements. So if we wanted to include this 4040 property within a TIF document, we could marry the two together potentially. As well as maybe identify some other target areas throughout the city. We do need to designate a specific property or area, however. We've had some conversations with your TIF attorney about how specific we need to be. We don't want to necessarily tip the HRA's hand in terms of the marketplace. We don't want to designate certain properties that may cause us to have to increase the value of those sites because the HRA potentially is interested in them. But it might be beneficial to go through an internal look and identify an array of areas throughout the city that we do want to target. That is one option. Or it could be an ad hoc approach where as a particular development comes forward, you hold a specific public hearing to add that property onto the TIF plan. So.
Yeah, and it feels to me, just intuitively, we'd be better off with the second alternative, because otherwise it just looks like we're just casting a super wide net and saying we got to rush out and spend money, versus here's a very specific opportunity that we have. And I'm thinking in terms of how you explain that to people at a public hearing, right? It's always easier to explain a specific goal that you have and what you're trying to accomplish and get people to understand that and either agree with you or not, but you have that discussion versus just sort of this broad and potentially really confusing conversation. But I could change my mind on that. I'm just saying, just feels that way.
I think the point to hammer home is there is a process involved. It is a somewhat lengthy process. It takes a little bit of the HRA's ability to be nimble within the marketplace out of the equation. But I fully agree with you as far as the communication piece and having a very deliberate message. That does make sense.
And I actually believe that because we have the Housing Foundation, they're our nimble partner, and then we can be a little bit more, going through that process. Now, obviously, there's still timing and all that. So again, I'm open to other options. It's just want to be a little careful about just casting too big a net.
And if I may, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
Please.
I think one of the things that perhaps it would be better discussed in the Amundsen is whether or not we do want to identify this 4040 as a designated property within that TIF hearing process. I think that would be something that would be of interest to hear from the HRA today, whether it happens as part of this discussion or in the next discussion. That is something that we could identify right now to keep the HRA nimble and marry those two processes up together. Otherwise, if the HRA did want to pursue the 4040, we'd have to start from scratch and do a new public hearing process a little bit later on in the cycle.
And just to be clear, what I'm saying is, in that scenario, I'm perfectly fine with that, assuming we think this is a good project and to move ahead with it. If we know that, then putting that in one hearing, I would be completely okay with that. I'm just saying, just trying to wildly predict, parts of the city and pull those in. It's just a harder conversation, I think.
Commissioner Brindle.
Thank you. I think my questions all along have really been from the perspective of we're on a schedule. And if we've got a timeline in which we need to, if we're going to use these funds, we're going to need to use them. Otherwise, we lose access to them and we lose the funds. And so in looking at how successful are we as a city at attracting affordable housing developers to come in and do this on their own? And we have not been. The market developers come in and, albeit it's wonderful to have a city that has predominantly in its new rental options these luxury apartments. But I'm not going to live there. I can't do that. There's a lot of people out there like me who will make a choice whether when we sell our current single-family home, if we can live here. And I know that there are those of us where our kids would love to live here, and they can't. Having our median single-family home value at $550,000, and that figure hasn't sat. It is notching up several times during the year of 2019. And if that continues to happen, the values of other real estate in the city are also going to go up, maybe not to that degree, but I don't see them going backward. So looking at developing affordable housing and having that available for those who work here and those who desire to live here, I don't think they really have a choice, and I think that's the purpose of an HRA, frankly, is to look at what are the best ways the city can intervene and and designate land uses for the benefit of the community, for the benefit of a diverse population. So looking at how best to do that, I think we're very fortunate to have a housing foundation that we can partner with. I did have the benefit of a couple of meetings since we last met to kind of talk through the process of the foundation and how it is that they consider participation in a transaction. And this transaction sits just squarely right in what they want to do, and be able to provide for the community. And I think we probably all know this, but the creation of the foundation was really to make the condominiums at Centennial Lakes affordable and find ways to get people into those condominiums in a transit-friendly area, in a beautiful area, walkable area that needed affordable housing. So it's not a new issue, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. So looking at this, we have really three affordable housing fund buckets. One is completely under our control, and that is the trust fund. And the other two are in districts that will expire. One of them, we know the date that it's going to expire via special legislation, and the other one is the pooling district of Southdale, and that's going to expire at some point. It's not too far out, is it?
That's,
If I can address
Yeah,
that question.
please.
So,
Yeah.
so Southdale 2 essentially has the two pieces
Right.
together, right?
Right.
So we know that the special legislation requires that we're establishing new TIF districts by 2021, and we can pool a portion of the Southdale money to help those new TIF districts or the development within those new TIF districts.
Okay, so
that's
stop.
that's
yeah, and so when you say pool the Southdale money, is that the other bucket, or is that this $4 million bucket?
That is that bucket of $4 million because
Okay.
we've already had some projects that are in the queue.
Right.
There's also, as you mentioned, another bucket of funds, also within Southdale 2. It's just sort of your normal pooling allowance that you can utilize for housing. That doesn't have as tight of a time frame on it. You will still have to report these TIF funds. They're still restricted in their use, but you're not dealing with the 2021 sunset. In fact, you can maintain those balances beyond the life of the Southdale 2 TIF district, just like
Okay.
Centennial Lakes perhaps would be another example.
Okay.
You still have to report it on an annual basis. You're still, under the purview of the state auditor as far as what your plan is to expend those funds.
but they
you
won't,
can-
they won't continue to gain increment and grow after 12/31.
It will not. After 2021, that district will be decertified. That's its maximum life under its statutory authority. And at that point in time, it will be a balance on hand, a portion of which will have to repay the loan or be returned, no matter what, a portion of which can be used for affordable housing purposes going forward.
Okay, so the Southdale 2 TIF housing pool also sunsets in 2021? Is that what I just heard you say, or am I confused?
The special legislation pool sunsets in 2021.
Right, I understand
We don't have
that.
the ability to create new projects at that point in time.
Right, so the other one.
The other one does not sunset. You don't collect any more revenue, so it will just be a balance that is on hand, and it can be utilized
So
for-
the district goes away, but the pool sits?
The
Yes.
pool,
Yes,
the
yes,
pool
yes,
sits. Right.
yes. I guess that was my question. When
You're
does
right.
the district go away?
And actually, one of the things that we accomplished in the last session was we got those years to be linked up. They were different, but we got the special legislation to link all the way out to 12/31/21.
Okay, so they're
So-
both 21.
Yeah, so they were.
So
they
they're
weren't-
both 21, one goes away at the end of 21, and the other one sits, and we can use those funds, as any TIF,
Correct.
yeah.
That tax
Okay.
base then in after 12/31/21 of Southdale 2 then goes out to the regular taxing jurisdictions.
Sure. All right. Okay, well, TIF is always kind of a muddy pool for me, so I appreciate the clarification. Thank you.
I think there's one other important clarification there too, and that is, as Ms. Hawkinson mentions in her memo, that with respect to the Southdale 2 TIF housing pool, which has, as she notes, an anticipated balance of $7.2 million, I expect the anticipation date is the end of December of 2021. That's a 15-year limitation on the use of those funds for affordability, as opposed to the Southdale 2 special legislation has a 25-year horizon on affordability.
Correct. The special legislation requires that the projects that are being assisted provide at a minimum 25 years
At a minimum.
of the affordability.
Okay.
The
That's good to know.
The normal pooling requires a 15-year
All right.
time span.
That's
as
a good
minimum.
clarification, because the memo itself says the affordability period is 25 years, but it's 25 years at a minimum, so this is where we've been able to create housing in
Negotiate.
perpetuity, basically.
Correct.
In terms of its affordability. So, as Commissioner Fisher said, the notion of identifying properties to be included in the Southdale 2 district and create a TIF district that would include not only Amundsen, but 4040 West 70th Street seems to me to be a logical sort of thing to do. This is a little bit of a side question for our finance director, but with respect to the TIF balance remaining, we've got a loan to repay, and that loan that we talked about repaying is a loan that the Centennial Lakes TIF district made to the Simon Development folks to be able to maximize their remodel of the mall. And so that now has a remaining balance of $3+ million. That'll go back to the Centennial Lakes TIF fund, which is now at the end of its life. I mean, that's been terminated. So does that money then just rolls back to the county when it's repaid, or what happens to that money, I guess is a better way to put the question.
Chair and members of the HRA, so the money will go back into the Centennial Lakes TIF district, and part of our economic development work plan for the next couple of years is to develop a program to spend the funds strategically. So the money will stay in the Centennial Lakes TIF district.
Okay, so it can sit in the Centennial Lake district without having to be paid back to the county for then being dispersed amongst the taxing entities, the city, the school district, and the county.
That's correct.
All right. So we can use it for, what kind of improvements then can we use that money for?
Bill, you want to talk about what we've done with Centennial Lakes?
Sure thing. The Centennial Lakes TIF district was decertified, I believe, in 2011 or 2012. And at that point, there was a balance in the fund. That district is an older district, and so Minnesota law allows the funds to be used with a little bit more flexibility than is possible today. Over the years, the city has used those monies to invest in infrastructure throughout the city. So some projects include a portion of the new parking structure at 50th and France was constructed with those funds. The road improvements up and down France Avenue that we did back in 2012, 2013, with all the intersection improvements was funded with those monies. We funded some improvements in the Grandview District at the intersection of Vernon and Interlochen. We funded some improvements at Wooddale and Valley View. We funded the improvements to several other intersections around Southdale, York and 66th. There's a couple others that I'm missing. The Promenade, we funded part of that Phase 5 Promenade with those monies. So we've really used those funds throughout the city to deliver the infrastructure projects that have been in our CIP in the capital improvement plan. There is a balance in that fund. It's in the range of $4 to $5 million. So certainly, as Director Urim had mentioned, next year we want to come up with a more specific strategy to continue to invest those monies until they are extinguished. But we hope to deliver those projects in the ground in a way that benefits the entire city.
All right, so there's $4 million remaining in the Centennial Lakes TIF fund at present. If that loan's repaid, we'll have around $7 million?
I'd have to do the math, but it's in that range.
In that range, okay. All right, and to the extent we have more flexibility with those funds, and we think about the difficulty of continuing to fund infrastructure and operational activities at Centennial Lakes, can they be used for operational purposes, those funds, or do they have to be used for infrastructure improvements?
Oh, good question. So while these monies do have more flexibility than current, they don't have that much flexibility. So they still have to be used to fund infrastructure improvements in the city. They can't be used for operations or for maintenance. Those types of routine things are in the city's regular budget. So yeah, they need to be invested in a way that you can actually point to something that was constructed and delivered.
Were those funds used to build those 2 new bridges at Centennial Lakes?
I don't believe they were. I'm not sure what the source of that money was.
That was park dedication from the Loden, for the most part.
Okay. Those are all the questions I had. Anybody else that raise any further questions? Yeah, hold on, Don.
No, actually, this is
Anderson.
for Director Hawkinson. Just a couple or 3 more. Thank you. Okay, so I didn't see any reference to solving for an AMI percentage, and maybe that isn't even germane to this conversation this morning. But do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, our policy calls for 60% generally or 50%. And I don't know what you might be aiming for here, if there's any thought at all to that.
Chair, Commissioners, in preliminary conversations, it would be 100% affordable to households with incomes at or below 60%.
Okay. And it almost doesn't make any difference, frankly, with age-restricted housing, because incomes are normally or often relatively low, although assets can be high, and assets don't really enter into the qualification. Is that accurate? On senior housing?
Chair, Commissioners, there is a formula that looks at assets, but there's a cap on assets. You can't have an extraordinarily high balance sheet with assets, but when they look at income, they look at the income derived off the assets, so the interest that's earned off of them, that it can be liquid.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Okay. The Southdale Experience Guidelines suggests 3 stories and 36 feet. And I guess one of the questions I have, there's also a reference in the staff report on a 4-story structure, because that's possible under the current zoning ordinance. And that maybe this is actually a better question for Director Teague. I'm just kind of wondering in general, and I know you haven't done a deep dive there. You've got 1.58 acres, and if the design guidelines are met at 3 stories, is that a limitation on units? We've got hard pack requirements there to meet, and I'm just, it may be premature, but I'm just wondering about that.
So just when comparing the guidelines to the zoning, if if they developed under the current zoning ordinance, which allows housing as a conditionally permitted use, they could do a 4-story building. So potentially they could go taller with more green space, or if we held to the guidelines, there might be, there may be more building coverage on the ground if they can't go as high. But we haven't done a deep dive into the site to really compare the two.
Okay, it's more of a question. I'm wondering more than a question. Thank you very much.
As a follow-on to Commissioner Anderson's question, so when I look at your cost per door number at $32,479 at an acquisition price of $3.8 million, does that anticipate a 4-story or a 3-story building?
It anticipates 117 units. So based on what Director Teague said, if it's a 3-story building, it may be wider. And if it's a 4-story building, it may be taller with more green space.
All right.
So we haven't done a massing study, but based on zoning, we believe we can get up to 117 units, so it's based on that.
Right, good. Thank you. Commissioner Staunton.
Just one follow-up on Commissioner Anderson's conversation. So in terms of the area median income of 60% or 50%, those percentages, I assume, are applicable in the Southdale 2 TIF housing pool and the Southdale 2 TIF special legislation, but would not be applicable in our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. We could use that for 80% or 100% or 120% of AMI.
Chair, Commissioners, I would have to review the ordinance for the creation of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, but my understanding is that there's significantly more flexibility for the trust funds, that there's no state statute that's regulating them.
And on the other two, I mentioned 60 and 50, but is there an 80% available, or is there an averaging or any of that? Can you speak to that just a little bit?
Yes, Chair, Commissioners. With new this year, Minnesota Housing has allowed income averaging. The bonding requires 20% of the units to be affordable to households with incomes at or below 50% of area median income or fair market rents, whichever is lower. So 20% would have to comply with that if bonding is used. With tax credits, Minnesota Housing has now allowed for income averaging, that you can go up to 80% of area median income, but it needs to be offset on the other end. If you go down to 40% of area median income or 30% of area median income, so the average meets the 60% of area median income, then that can be allowed through the tax credits.
Thank you.
Other questions for Director Hawkinson? Good, thank you. Thanks for that update. All right, let's move on to the next matter, I think.
Well, so one of the things before we move on to the next matter, I mean, the discussion, we had a lot of questions. The discussion is, I think the question we left off with last time is, are we comfortable with the notion of kind of this role of playing in the development market, of acquiring property? We're at a stage where there's been a letter of intent, but the purchase agreement has not been signed yet. When Director Hawkinson, when would we have to enter into the purchase agreement on this property?
Chair, Commissioners, the purchase agreement, a draft has already been circulated amongst the foundation members. There is some desire by the seller to enter into it as soon as possible. The earnest money the foundation is prepared to pay. And
how much is that?
$250,000.
Okay.
And so they're paying that, and then there's 60 days between the execution of the purchase agreement and the sale of the property. It can be delayed by another 30 days, but then a portion of the earnest money goes hard.
And before the closing, we would have to, you'd come back to the HRA for approval of funds to purchase the property from the foundation, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Depending on the outcome of my next item and a discussion that we had already with Nick regarding the public hearing, I would be prepared to come back at the December HRA meeting.
Okay. So, the question is going to come back to us, and I know the last time that we had this discussion, one of the questions we knocked around a little bit is, are we comfortable with this notion of intervening in this marketplace and acquiring property for the purpose of achieving these affordable housing goals? And I just want to make sure we are saying that we're comfortable. I am. Mr. Chair, I know there's been some discussion about, the appropriate role of local government in this area. To me, we've had government intervention in this market for decades. I mean, probably the most prominent example that maybe everybody in this room has experienced is the mortgage interest deduction, which is the largest public housing subsidy in the history of our country. So the notion that the marketplace is free of any government participation is, to me, not an accurate notion. And I'm comfortable to achieve these goals, to keep trying to figure out the right answer on affordable housing and put another way, housing affordability, that this gives us the control over property and gives us an ability to keep trying to figure out this problem. So I'm supportive of it, but I just want to make sure that we're sending a clear message to staff as well as the foundation.
Yeah, well, that's a good thought. As I hesitated on whether to move forward to the next item, what I was thinking was that in the context of discussing the next item, and specifically Resolution 2019-10, we would be having this discussion about whether to include in the Southdale 2 district not only the Amundsen property, but 4040 West 70th Street. And so I thought inherent in that discussion would be this notion that Member Staunton has just raised, but certainly the way he's raised it is a cleaner way probably to move to the next item, is to discuss our level of comfort. And I think you heard embedded in my comments and in Member Fisher's, Councilmember Fisher's comments was the notion that, yeah, I'm comfortable including that the 4040 West 70th Street in that district. That would cause you to inherently believe that we're okay with buying property. But nonetheless, I think it's probably cleaner to have that conversation about whether we're comfortable buying property the way we did it with Amundsen, and to continue that other places. So now you've heard Member Staunton say that he's comfortable with it. There's an implicit endorsement of that notion, I think, in my comments and Commissioner Fisher's comments. We haven't heard from Commissioner Anderson or Commissioner Brindle yet, but
and if I can just add on, I appreciated Director Hawkinson, you including in the memo some discussion of what other cities in Minnesota and elsewhere have done, that this isn't unusual for local units of government to be involved in trying to acquire property for the purposes that their local HRAs are interested in achieving.
Well, and in my comments, I mentioned that we have not been successful at getting developers to come forward and develop affordable housing here. And maybe it is, I'm not an expert in the market, but maybe it is that it's just a very expensive business to be in. And if that's the case, and we desire to have housing for all in our community, for all who work in and around Edina, then I don't think we have a choice. And we have affordable housing goals to meet, and that we have made for ourselves as a healthy, diverse community, but also that the Met Council wants to see us meet as well. So It's, I think the HRA is serving, and I think I said this before, I think it's serving its purpose, and that's why it's here, to help our community to achieve those goals.
Commissioner Anderson?
Yeah, thank you. It just in listening, and thank you so much for putting a little bit better frame on this. That's useful. Because all in all, I'm very comfortable with the idea of age-restricted housing being made available, and especially if it's affordable. That's what works. I can tell you that from quite a bit of experience in it. What I guess my only hesitation in saying, yeah, I'm all in here is just that Commissioner Brindle mentioned that it's an expensive business to be in, and it is. And it is rife with risk. And I'm a little reluctant to say that we should just be jumping, and that, because I felt like that a couple of weeks ago. I don't feel quite as much like that today. I would feel much more comfortable in a discussion that was specific, but we're not there. And so you know, for me, I just don't personally like crossing that Rubicon. It feels like once we do that, now we're in the development business. And I'm reluctant to say, based on experience, that we should be doing that as a city, although I think that this location has a lot of benefit. And if I knew what we were going to try to put there, I would feel a little more comfortable. I do look at the neighborhood and the Cornelia neighborhood, and there's a reason that the Southdale design guidelines are in place. That's not to encroach into the neighborhood. The working assumption in the staff report is that we have 117 units there. Maybe that's the right number. Maybe less is better. So that's a ramble. However, that's my thoughts on it.
Okay, thank you. My understanding, Commissioner Anderson, would be that, you know, in saying that we generally endorse the notion that the HRA could potentially be in the business of purchasing property, it still seems to me that I'd want to see these on a one-off basis, you know, and so we can analyze each potential acquisition on the face of it without blindly saying, yeah, we'll buy anything you put in front of us. But I think in this situation, the leap of faith for me is fairly short span. We've got this housing foundation that's a great partner for us. We've got a few of those members in the audience this morning. They've got people helping them that are experts in the industry, and I think when they put this LOI together, it gave me and engendered for me a great deal of confidence that this would be something that the HRA could go forward on. When I look at Director Hawkinson's analysis of the potential per door cost at 117 units, it seems to me like it makes quite a bit of sense. So in this particular circumstance, I'm willing to move forward and not only talk about establishing the Amundsen Avenue Tax Increment Financing District, but also looking at including within that resolution 2019-10, establishing a similar district for 4040 West 70th Street. And yeah, Commissioner Fisher.
Yeah, I wanted to just follow up on, so at the last meeting, you know, I probably came across as very lukewarm at best, and it was really a result of, and I know that the speed and timing of when you have to come to us with some of these things is not ideal. So you're bringing the information you have and doing your best with it. But it felt at that time, it was more like, hey, we got a great site, we should just buy it because there's a site. Where the conversation here today and the information in the report is about a need that we can fill on this site. And that need is for, you know, age-restricted housing. And the reason, and you know, so elaborating on the fact that this site is a great site for, you know, a number of reasons that are stated in the report, is a different paradigm for me. And so I can be very comfortable with that, saying, wow, we can fill a need on this site, so let's go ahead and take advantage of an opportunity using the Housing Foundation and making all that work. And that works for me, versus just being sort of speculative and saying, oh, site available, let's buy it and figure out later what to do with it, because that is very much a developer role versus a public entity trying to fill a need that we have in a community.
Commissioner Staunton?
And I would just amplify on those comments by saying, this is part of the reason why we have a housing strategy task force, is to come up with some shape of kind of our goals and our objectives as a community for housing, whether that be affordable housing, whether that be the whole spectrum of affordability, whether that be types of housing. And as that moves forward, I think that'll give us better guidance as to how we want to enter into this marketplace. So right now, we have to deal with opportunities as they arise. Before we've finished building the airplane, we have to fly it. And I'm comfortable with doing that on the one-off basis that folks have talked about.
Other comments from folks? Okay, well, let's move on to the Resolution 2019-10 discussion around the Amundsen Avenue, potential Amundsen Avenue Tax Increment Financing District. Director Hawkinson.
Good morning again. As our last discussion is an excellent segue into this. I am prepared to discuss this development today, but I don't know if I am seeking approval of the resolution at this time. I would like to bring an amended resolution before you on December 12th and seeking to delay the public hearing for the creation of a TIF district from December 3rd to December 17th in order to be able to amend it and modify it to include this discussion. Some of the background information. You've heard about this project a lot. As you know, the Edina Housing Foundation acquired 7079 Amundsen in July 2018. And through a competitive RFP process, selected MWF Properties to develop the site into affordable housing. In July, the HRA approved acquiring the property from the foundation for $1.3 million using the Southdale 2 special legislative funds to facilitate the affordability. The HRA will then sell to MWF for $600,000, and that $600,000 will be returned to the TIF pool. MWF Properties will be developing 62 units of housing, 100% of which will be affordable. So the site is located within the 70th and Cahill Small Area Plan near the border of the Southeast Edina redevelopment area. Last night, the Planning Commission determined that the proposed development complies with the comprehensive plan. As Nick explained, to use the Southdale 2 TIF special legislative pooled funds, a TIF district must be created. So what is TIF? You've seen this slide before. Bill created this slide. And I don't know if I need to go through it all for you. But generally, it's the ability to capture and utilize most of the increased local property tax revenue from a new development within a defined geographical area. It's using the growth and the tax base from the new development to help fund eligible projects. The base taxes, the property taxes collected prior to the creation of the TIF district, continue to go to the taxing authorities. Just the increment, the change in the taxes due to the development are captured. As Nick stated, and based on my request at the previous HRA meeting to hold a public hearing to use the TIF, there must be a public hearing for adoption of the tax increment financing plan within the geographical area. So we want to do that now on December 17th, based on the incorporation of 4040 West 70th. Currently, we have 8 active TIF districts that are capturing 3.46% of Edina's gross tax base. As Bill has explained at previous meetings regarding TIF, relative to other metro area cities, Edina's use of TIF is minimal. Nonetheless, with the new proposed Amundsen Avenue TIF district, it is not our intention right now to capture the increment. Rather, this is a requirement for using the special legislation pooled funds. The special legislation allows the pooled funds to be used for the acquisition of property if certain conditions are met. At least 20% of the units are at or below 60% of area median income. Affordability requirement for a term of at least 25 years. In this case, MWF has pledged a 40-year affordability period, but they plan to hold the property long-term, so that could be longer. And a project is within a district established under Edina special legislation can utilize additional Southdale 2 TIF funds. This is what we are seeking now and on December 17th, approval to create this district. You discussed this on the last item, but with these funds, the estimated balance for the special legislation portion is $7.5 million. We've already committed 2.9 to 4100 Edina, that's the Aon project. And at this point, and on the 17th, I'd like to commit have the public hearing for the 1.3 for this site, and then that leaves the 4.4. Although the increment is not expected to be used, the TIF's plans budget does retain a use of the increment in case there's a budget shortfall. If this is needed, I would seek approval from the City Council, but we would not need to go through the whole TIF process again by including it in the plan at this time. Questions, and they're probably more for Nick than for me, but I'm willing to answer what I can.
Sure.
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Brindle.
Yes, thank you. So the last statement that you made, it's not anticipated to use the increment?
Correct. Chair and Commissioners, the only funds that are being requested at this time is the 1.3 for acquisition that would come out of the pooled funds. So we're not anticipating capturing the increment to be used in the development. We have included that in the TIF plan to capture the increment in case, for some reason, the bottom falls out of tax credit pricing or something happens and there's a gap. It's allowing some flexibility that I would come back to get approval to use that, but we're not anticipating at this time of needing it.
Okay, so it's a TIF district. The other TIF districts that we have captured the increment, and we've used those dollars for the public good around that development. So in the Amundsen development, what you're saying is it's a TIF district, but we're not going to capture the increment?
We're not planning on capturing the increment, that is
Okay.
correct, but it is written into the plan.
You're just going to use the pooled funds for what you would use the increment for if you were going to use it?
That is correct. That is what we're seeking now. Now, as a caveat, and this hasn't been fully vetted yet, there would be possibly the opportunity, there's discussion of connecting the bike path from to the 9 Mile Creek, or the Three Rivers and 9 Mile Creek path. If there is a use that is directly connected to the housing, correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, we could use that for that purpose, the increment for that purpose. So if that became something that rises up to a need to either get the land or put that path in place, we could conceivably do that with increment.
Well, how would you do that if you didn't set up the TIF district to capture the increment?
Do you want to explain how that?
Thank you. The special legislation requires that we create and certify and establish this TIF district. That's something that
Understood.
we have to do no matter what.
Yep.
The question becomes whether or not we actually use that revenue to assist this project or other affordable housing, or if we simply turn it back on an annual basis. That'll be up to the purview of the HRA. Throughout the life of this district, you'll have that opportunity every year, essentially, to turn back those funds, as long as we don't commit them to financing this project. As Ms. Hawkinson stated, the TIF plan right now preserves the flexibility to be able to utilize those future tax dollars for this project if that's something the HRA wants to pursue. The project's not developed yet. There could be changes that money could address and help facilitate the development of that project. Right now, as negotiated with MWF, it's not needed. But it's a resource available to the HRA, and it would be subject to the HRA's approval.
So we would capture the increment and decide on an annual basis how the increment would be used if we desire to use it.
Correct. Or
Okay.
we can establish in the plan that it's not available to be used. That is an option to the HRA right
Okay.
now. But we do need to establish this TIF district, unfortunately, under the guidelines of the special
Sure.
legislation, which we tried to change,
Understood.
but we're not granted. The district does need to be established. It will operate as a TIF district. It's purely whether or not the HRA will turn back the funds or not.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Fisher.
The way I would compare it, just if you think about recent TIF discussions we've had, I think the Pentagon Park South, if you remember, there was a whole page of uses. So we had to approve the TIF district, and we approved the uses for those funds, where in this case, we don't have uses. There's no designation. We would actually have to formally approve a designation of using any funds out of this particular district. And I actually like the notion of having it there in the case, for me, it's always about what kind of public infrastructure can we build that, relates to the projects. And in this case, that trail connection is an important part of this small area plan. And if I recall, there's potential property purchase and trail construction, a lot of things that may or may not actually want to happen here. So I think that's a good way to kind of have it in our back pocket if we need it.
Is there a prohibition on using the pooled funds for some of those trail connections?
No, that would be an eligible expense as well, either the acquisition or construction of the housing itself, development of the site, as long as it is tied directly to the affordable housing project and those committed units that are going to abide by the 25-year limitation, then it's an eligible expense, an eligible capital expense.
Thank you. Other questions for Ms. Hawkinson at this point in time? All right, so this becomes a discussion item, and your suggestion is to defer this matter until what?
I would
date do you
like
want?
the,
second meeting in December?
Yes, I'd like to have the public hearing, rather than being December 3rd, have it be December 17th. And then I would come back to the city council next week to make the same request.
Okay, but the resolution you'd still like to have passed today?
No,
Or is there-
I think
you're looking to amend it to add in the 4040 property.
I am looking to amend
Yeah.
it.
And
It
then bring
could
it
be
back to
signed,
us at
and
a
then
different-
another one created for the 17th, or we can amend this one to include 4040.
And wait on
And
this
wait on
until
this
you
one.
do the whole one, okay.
Correct.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Ms. Hawkinson, I should have probably brought this question up when we were talking about the other property, but they're related. So you mentioned that MWF is committed to a 40-year term of keeping units affordable in the Amundsen project. And the struggle I've had a little bit with the property over on 70th, or the other property, is that we're talking about, a minimum of 25 year. And 25 years is fine, but if we're going to go through all this effort to develop affordable housing, I want to see it as long-term as it can possibly be. So I'm assuming, and maybe this is more a question or a statement to the Housing Foundation, that whatever you did to solicit developer proposals and ending up with a 40-year term, do that again. Try, let's figure out a way when we're measuring the criteria of developers coming to us that we're getting, as long a term as we can get. Otherwise, what have we really benefited from in terms of developing our own? So, thank you.
Other comments, questions? All right. So I don't think we have to, this doesn't require any action today at all. Do you want something?
I think for the minutes, having you move to have it delayed until December, the public hearing until December 17th would be beneficial.
Okay. All right. Is there a motion to set the public hearing for Resolution 2019-10 in its amended form for December 17, 2019?
With the direction to staff to amend the draft resolution.
That's correct.
And bring it back to us prior to that.
To include 4040.
So moved.
Second.
Motion second to defer the public hearing on amended Resolution 2019-10, which would include the Amundsen proposal for establishing an Amundsen tax increment financing district and a tax financing district for 4040 West 70th to December 17, 2019. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And then you want to talk a little bit about the tax relief pilot program?
Yes. I'm dominating your morning.
We've got some folks with some other time commitments here too, so I'm wondering, Commissioner. Commissioner Fisher, you're okay for a little bit? Okay, thank you.
Okay. Last year at this time, I presented to you, and you approved a 4D pilot program that was to address the preservation of NOAA properties. And a tie to this program was an energy efficient grant program. We had a 15-year affordability and up to $50,000 of grant money that would be available to the different NOAA property owners. I had no takers. So I reached out to each property manager and each owner individually, and there was no interest. So as we've discussed, affordable housing is comprised of three main strategies. We just talked about producing new units. We're talking about protecting residents and preserving existing affordable housing. So the NOAA 4D program was designed for protecting residents to give them some additional housing security and to preserve the existing units that are naturally affordable. NOAA is a term used to describe housing that is affordable, not because of public subsidies. The property is naturally affordable because of its age or lack of amenities or the inclination of the owner. In Edina, there are 61 separate addresses defined as rental apartments with 4 or more units. Of these, 27 have affordable units. It doesn't mean that they're 100% affordable. It means that within there, either the 1 bedrooms or the 2 bedrooms, their rents are at affordable levels. And so a recent calculation based on a CoStar report was that we have just shy of 1,200 affordable units. And this could change anytime. I mean, properties have been for sale and bought by new owners. They could increase the rents. So the idea with the 4D strategy is to incentivize owners of NOAA properties with 4 or more units to keep their rents affordable. And this is done by reducing their property tax obligation on the affordable housing units. And with this revised pilot program, it's even to reduce the barriers to participate in the program. And then, as I stated, to increase housing security for the residents. The difference between this year's program and last year's program is the financial assistance has been reduced to reflect a reduction in the time commitment to keep the properties affordable. As stated, last year we offered up to $50,000 per property in exchange for a 15-year commitment, and with the energy efficiency grant. Well, when talking to property owners who are having these affordable units with no government involvement at all, and then I come along and say, well, with some money, I'll save you some money, but I want you to sign this form, and you have to keep these properties affordable for 15 years, and we're going to check on you every year to make sure you're doing that. They're like, we don't want government involvement in our business. It's not worth it to us for that savings, and we'll risk bumping up our rents every year and just doing what we're doing without you meddling in our affairs. I can't really fault them for that. So, but at the same time, they are telling me that the pressure of property tax and the increase in property taxes is putting pressure on the rents. And if they could get some relief from that, they can keep the rents affordable. But this biting into this 15 years was just too risky. So after talking with them, we thought, okay, how about 2 years? We'll give you far less money, maybe $2,500 per building, still $100 per unit, and we'll enter into a 2-year agreement. You'll receive that property tax reduction for 2 years. You'll see how it affects your business plan, and then you can decide, yeah, this is really worth it. I'm saving a lot. This is great. Or you can decide it's still not worth it. And then after 2 years, either decide to work with me on extending the time period, and maybe we can, still have our energy efficiency program in place, our 15-year program in place. I mean, that hasn't gone away, but this is to test the waters, wet the whistle, see if this reduction in property taxes really does make it worth it. So with 4D, to be able to get this tax classification, there has to be a financial exchange between government and the property owner. So that's why, we can't just grant them 4D. We have to give them money, and they have to enter into a contract with us, a LURA, a declaration on the property to keep the rents. So we do have a role in it. So I thought, let's reduce it to $2,500 per building, still $100 per unit, and enter into a 2-year LURA. So I'm asking for $50,000 for this revised pilot. It would come out of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, as was stated previously, that is our most flexible source of funds. We don't have to go through public hearings. We don't have to jump through any hoops. We can designate $50,000. We'd still have 1.2 right now available for other programs. And then I'll go back out to the property owners and talk to them and just see if this is something, because I think we all are wrestling with how to preserve NOAA properties. And NOAA property owners are wrestling with the fact that they've been working fine and well without us. So just trying to find some middle ground for them.
Questions for Manager Hawkinson?
Can I ask, just on that last slide there, if you could go back one slide? So the 2018 4D pilot program, $160,000, have we spent any of that?
0.
Okay, so it would still be dedicated, but so far we haven't used it. So potentially at some point that could just come back into the $1.2 million pool.
Yes.
And
Chair
just as a
Commissioner
one question I maybe should have asked earlier, is the Guitar Center site money in the trust fund yet?
Chair Commissioners, no. The 2.1 million does not reflect those funds.
So, and that would be how much?
$1.8 million.
1.9 million.
I was
Okay,
gonna say
thank you.
1.8, but- And I think they're planning on a spring groundbreaking, so get a building permit in the spring?
Yeah.
All right.
So then the fund will increase at that time.
Commissioner Brindle?
So I was reading this and going, all right, if I were, and I approached it kind of the same way you described it. If I'm a property owner and I have apartments and I do my duty and make sure I've got some price points at a variety of levels, and not anticipating your knock at the door, it must be a surprise. But at the same time, you the increase in property taxes. So I kind of mulled this over. So we want to incentivize NOAA property owners who are NOAA property owners by virtue of the fact that they own something that has affordable rents. With 4 or more units, and the purpose is to keep rents affordable in exchange for property tax savings and some dollars exchanged. And we would achieve that purpose over time by reducing property tax obligation on the property, thereby on the affordable units. And then possibly over that 2-year period, reduce the barrier for that property owner to say, well, this is a good thing, I saved some money. And so I guess it's a program that would have to prove itself, is how I read it. And hoping after 2 years that people would enter into the pilot and try it out and just see if it's something that would work for them. Now, if it were something that would work for them and it gained some momentum going forward, how would it look the same moving forward? Would it continue to be 4 more units? Or could there be, I don't know if there's anything like this for single-family homeowners who have homes that fit into this area of affordability. It's not 4 more units, but it is our most prevalent quantity of affordable housing.
Chair, Commissioners, the 4D program is set by states. It's a state program. And so it's the state that has decided that the 4 more units are the ones that qualify. Properties with fewer than 4 units do not qualify. I do know that back when I started working in affordable housing, there used to be this old home program. If someone had a modest priced home and were a modest income and they did improvements on their home, they could apply to have their property not assessed at a higher value, so their taxes stayed stable. That law went away. I do know that the community land trusts are drafting legislation for homes that are in land trusts to have their properties valued at a different rate than their neighbors because they don't own the land. But that legislation hasn't been approved. It's being drafted. So there are different efforts to work on that, but the 4D right now is only for properties with 4 or more units. And the tax benefit goes away when the LURA, or the declaration, expires. So when we enter into a 2-year agreement, there's paperwork that gets submitted to the state. And when the commitment to keep those units affordable expires, so does the tax benefit.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Commissioner.
So I know you're trying to thread the needle here in terms of making it too onerous and, so people would want to actually participate. So maybe it doesn't happen as part of this pilot, but it occurs to me that one of the real benefits of this is that you're having conversations with the owners of the properties that are, in this category, that if they do participate in the program, is it possible to get sort of an agreement that, say they decide to sell their property, that we get first notification before they go into that process? Because that, to me, would be the greatest benefit of all, is that we lose these properties because we're just not aware they're going on the market, and there they are, they're gone.
Chair, Commissioner, that is a larger discussion and one that is, from my understanding, heavily criticized by property owners. Most do not like that first notification. The other cities are trying it. It's not something I'm not going to explore. We're starting to have early discussions on, tenant protection ordinances and things like that will include property owners. So that is on the docket to have a discussion. I don't think I can roll it in. I know that's not what you're suggesting at this time, because I think that would kill this pilot. But I know it's happening in other communities.
And I guess maybe what I'm suggesting is not, because this is, again, it's just such a fine line between partnerships and cooperation and collaboration and just government getting in the way. And maybe the best thing that's happening right now is you're just forming relationships with people. You're having some conversations, and maybe that's the best we can do. But it's just something thrown out there that in the spirit of that, if we could have more communication and know if somebody, somebody's getting to the point where they just want to release their assets and their family or whatever, it'd be nice, nice to know that.
Chair, Commissioner, I think with the rental licensure that was put in place at the beginning of the month that is going to also provide additional opportunities. There have been very, very early discussions about having training sessions that will really benefit property owners and getting them together, clearly on a volunteer basis. Other communities have also done that, and that has helped with the continuation and formulation of relationships and communication.
Great, thank you.
Other comments, questions? Commissioner Staunton?
I would just kind of pick up on that and say I applaud your creativity. I think we have to just keep trying stuff and seeing what works, and perhaps the best benefit is starting to have these relationships and conversations with property owners so that we can learn from them as to what might work and what pressures are they under, what dynamics are they considering as they're trying to manage their own portfolio.
Other comments? Yes, Commissioner Anderson.
Yeah, thank you. A question. This is a state regulated program. Is there anything well, Commissioner Brindle's question, I think, was to the mark. Is there anything that we can do independent of that might address single families or duplexes? Because I do think that there's a fair number. Well, we know that there have been a lot of investors active in the Edina marketplace, and many single families are held by investors. The nature of the investor is that they tend to be very shrewd about managing their assets, and nobody wants to limit their potential equity position. And that's why, so I think you're very wise to look at a shorter timeline. But I just wonder, do we have the latitude to think of it independently as it might relate to additional properties?
Chair, Commissioners, I would have to get back to you on that. I don't know. I would have to talk to the assessing department. I don't know all the legal ramifications of municipalities doing property tax abatement or any sort of property tax relief, since there's so many other taxing entities that are involved and so much of it is governed by state law. So I would have to do some additional digging on that.
Okay. Thank you.
This is another segue off of Commissioner Fisher and Commissioner Staunton, but it strikes me that as you develop these relationships with some of the property owners, that somewhere along the line in that conversation you could discuss with them their exit strategy and maybe even a right of first refusal to, don't forget about us. We'd love to have a right of first refusal to buy your properties when you decide to sell them if it seems like it makes sense to you and makes sense to us. So just another reinforcement on that notion. When I look at the process and the program requirements, it looks to me like, when they go to sign this participation agreement, they've provided you a rent roll. And I'm wondering about the sort of practical aspects of it in terms of they supply the rent roll, but how do you know they just haven't raised the rents right before they come to you, and they try to have it both ways. They raise the rents and then they come to you for a property tax reduction at $100 a door. How do we make sure that they're still in that affordable price range when we go to sign them up and agree to enter into a participation agreement with them?
Chair, Commissioners, right now I get my rental information from a research agency called CoStar, and I know our assessing department uses that often as well. So with the licensure, we'll have different mechanisms. I mean, there won't be an onerous number of participants in this where we couldn't check on that. They do have to submit these documents to the state. So I would need to check on what the state does also for verification that the information is true and accurate. But part of the rent roll is also ensuring that the rents are within those limits. Okay. So the initial occupants, the idea is not to kick out anyone who's currently living there. So an initial occupant, they may have the rents that are affordable, but the occupant may be over income. The intention is not to kick out that occupant, but on turn that they would need to get a resident in there who is income qualified.
All right. That cause anybody else to ask any questions? I know you'll be mindful of that. It's just a kind of a heads up.
Yeah.
Keep an eye on that.
Sure.
All right. So I think what you're looking for today is a motion to approve the revised 4D tax relief pilot program. Move it to a 2-year period, $100 per unit, maximum of $2,500 for building, per building, and you want to fund it with $50,000 out of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. That will be your source of funds. Is that a fair representation of what you'd like us to move on today? All right, is there a motion to that effect?
Second.
We got a motion second to approve the revised 4D tax relief pilot program as described. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. Very good. Thank you, Ms. Hawkinson. And is there, I guess you had one letter in the correspondence. Nothing else has come in, I'm sure. Do we have any HRA commissioner comments? All right. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved. Second.
Motion second to adjourn. Discussion. All those in favor of adjourning, say aye. 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 Opposed? Carried. Very good.